my good friend, Regi Carpenter. Regi Carpenter, I met Regi years and years and years ago. And then we met again at Sharing the Fire, the Northeast Storytelling Festival. And we became quite good chums. She is one of the bravest, the strongest storytellers I've seen. And as Laura said, she is going to tell one of Hans Christian Andersen's more popular tales. Please enjoy wonderful Regi Carpenter.
Thank you, Simon. And good morning, everybody. You know, it had been a lovely summer in the country. The golden sun shone on the yellow corn and green oats, and the haystacks that were piled up all around the field poked the sky with their needles. There were deer eating in the field, and next to the field there was a forest, dark and cool. All kinds of creatures lived in there, things that hopped and jumped and flew and burrowed into the ground, like mice and voles and rabbits. All throughout the forest there were great pools of water, cool and deep. They were fed by a clear stream. Now, around one of those pools of water, there was a bush. In the bush, there was a nest. In the nest, there were 5 eggs. And sitting on top of the 5 eggs was a mother duck. She had been sitting a very long time. Quack. And then she felt it. Well, first she heard it. She heard a crack, and then she felt something wriggling from underneath her. And out from underneath her came, a beautiful little duckling. Its golden down shone in the sun. Its eyes were round and dark, and it had apricot-colored feet. It looked up at its mother and said, "Peep." Well, shortly after, the second, the third, and the 4th egg cracked. She felt something wriggling, and out came the duckling. They were all just so beautiful. She was so happy, and just then an old duck walked by. "I see you have your brood. Oh, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful." "Oh, yes, but there's one egg that hasn't hatched. It's bigger than the others." "Oh, perhaps that's a turkey's egg. Stand up and let me have a look at it." "Oh, yes, I see. That is indeed a turkey's egg. I was once convinced to sit on a turkey's eggs myself. And well, when I got down to the water, you can imagine my surprise when that little duckling, what I thought, just didn't get into the water. It couldn't swim a lick. I say, yes, 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 that is a turkey's egg. And I think you should just cut your losses and walk away right now." "Well, I've sat so long. I think I'll sit a little longer." "Well, suit yourself," said the old duck, and away she waddled. It wasn't long when once again the mother duck felt something wriggling underneath her. She heard a crack, and out from underneath her came, "Oh, you are the ugliest duckling I have ever seen." And it's true. Instead of golden down, it had brown down, and its feet were black, and its eyes were very, very large, and it had a black beak, and instead of saying peep like its brothers and sisters did, it said peep. "Well, perhaps you are a turkey after all. Let's go down to the water, and if you don't swim, well, I'm going to let some other turkey take care of you." So she led all of her children down to the water. It wasn't very far. She glided into the water, and the waters parted. And behind her, she heard peep, 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 peep. She looked behind her, and that ugly little duckling was swimming and swimming. Why, he's the best swimmer of all. And you know, if I squint at him, he's not really all that ugly. She taught them how to dive under the water and pick through the seaweed and the algae to get their food. After a while, she said, "Now, children, it's time for us to go to the barnyard. So We are going to meet the old Spanish duck. She's very important. She has a red band around her leg. And once she meets you, you will be in proper society, if she approves, of course. Now, there's a few things you have to know before we go to the barnyard. Don't quack unless you're quacked too. Make sure you don't get near the cow. She's very clumsy, and if she steps on you, it'll be all over. And whatever you do, beware of the cat. Now, heads up, tails out, march. Peep, 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 peep. They entered the barnyard, and the ducks living in the barnyard said, all we need, more ducks. What's wrong with the last one? He's exceedingly ugly. The mother duck took her babies and stood in front of the old Spanish duck. She looked at the first one. Beautiful. And the second, oh, so lovely. The third, adorable. The fourth, so sweet. And the fifth, oh, what's wrong with him? Oh, well, he's not really that attractive, but he has a very sweet disposition, and he's an excellent swimmer. I'll see if you can do something about him, said the Spanish duck. And the mother duck and the Spanish duck turned their backs to the little ducklings and began to chat. And when they did, the turkey cock, with spurs on his feet, flew up to the ugly duckling and bit him in the neck. Well, that was a signal to all the other creatures in the barnyard to begin to mistreat the ugly duckling. They all began jostling him and pushing him and saying the most terrible things, how ugly he was and how unwanted he was for the way that he looked. The poor little ugly duckling tried to stay out of everyone's way. But day after day after day after day, everyone mistreated him, even his own brothers and sisters. And I'm sorry to say, after a while, his own mother turned her back on him. The little girl who would come in and spread grain in the barnyard, well, she even kicked the poor little duckling. After a while, he just couldn't stand it anymore, and he ran away as fast as he could, for his wings were still too small to fly. He went down to a moor, and on that dark, cool water, he found a secluded place to hide. He was so sad. Where in the world can this little duck go? Now that I have no family, where in the world can this little duck go? Nobody wants me. And tears fell from his eyes and rippled on the surface of the water. In the morning, he saw that he shared the moor with some wild geese and ducks. They swam right over to him and said, "Oh, boy, you are ugly. Woo! You are some kind of ugly. But hey, we don't mind. You can hang out with us. We're going over to a nearby lake. There's some really good ducks and geese. They are good-looking girls. We're going to try to get girlfriends, maybe even wives. Hey, maybe you can get a wife." Well, the little duckling thought he was much too young for such a big commitment, but he wanted a friend more than anything, and so he agreed to go. And just as the wild geese soared up into the sky, he heard pop, pop, pop. Hunters were shooting their guns, and those soaring geese that had once taken flight now began to twirl down to the surface of the water and landed dead. The water was tinged with their blood. The little ugly duckling was so frightened. He tried to swim away, but soon he heard pop, 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 pop all around him. He saw that the entire moor was surrounded by hunters. Some were sitting on benches, others were up in trees. Wild flocks of geese flew up into the air and then dropped to the ground and the water. Just then, a huge creature left its owner and waded into the water, barking and yipping. It came right next to the ugly duckling and then grabbed a dead goose in its mouth. The dog took the goose back to its owner. Oh, this is one time when my ugliness has saved me. Oh, this is a terrible place. And he hid his head underneath his wing, and he stayed very still and quiet until the hunters had gone. I can't stay here, he thought. This is a dangerous place. And as he was still young and couldn't quite fly as well as some of the other birds, he had to walk and fly a little bit. It was late in the day, and it was becoming night, and the sky was getting darker, and everything was becoming quiet. And so he flew and he walked as far as he could. He flew and he walked, and then a storm overtook him, and he sat in a pasture just shivering. He was hungry and cold. In the morning, he found that he was sleeping next to a very confused farmhouse. It didn't know if it wanted to fall to the right or to the left. And because it was so dilapidated, the door hung off of its hinge, and there was an opening, and the ugly duckling decided to go in through the door. He found a place to hide himself, and there he settled down until he felt a little warmer and not quite as scared. A few hours went by, and he started to make some sounds. Peep, 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 peep. What's that? Said the old woman living in the farm. She came out and saw the ugly little duckling. Oh, a duck. Oh, I love duck eggs. Oh, yes. Come in, come in, come in. And she made him a little nest. She didn't know that he was she didn't know that he wasn't a drake. She thought he was a girl duck. And as we all know, you can't get eggs from a boy. But she was ever hopeful. Oh, yes, oh, yes, oh, yes. Now, living in the farmhouse with her was an old tomcat, a black tomcat that wound itself around her legs and purred and arched its back. And when she stroked it backwards, sparks came off of its fur. She called him Mr. Mister. Also living with her was a chicken with very short legs, and she called that chicken unimaginatively Chicken Short Legs. They lived there very happily. Well, the chicken and the tomcat, Mr. Mister, thought they were more than half the world, and the better half too, and weren't afraid to share that thought with the ugly little duckling. And he said at one point, well, perhaps not everyone would agree with you. He had a little spunk inside of himself after all. Well, this caused Chicken Shortlegs to go off. You have been living here for 3 weeks, and have you laid one egg? No. Have you ever caught a mouse? You have no use to us. You're absolutely no good, no good. You're just one of those loafers. You sit around and you hope everybody takes care of you. Well, we have something else to think about you. You know, you just don't understand me, said the little ugly duckling. Oh, understand you. Oh, perhaps we should go to a therapist. Well, if you think you're so special, why don't you just take yourself out of here? Well, I think I shall, said the ugly little duckling. And without any more prompting, that ugly little duckling stood up and walked out of the farmhouse. He went down to the water. Even though he was alone, he thought, it's better to be by myself than with people who don't like or understand me. He wanted to go for a swim. Something inside him was just dying to go for a swim. He didn't want to sit on a nest anymore and pretend to lay eggs. He wanted to be himself. And so he began to dive under the water. And he felt the water break over his back. And he came up and he fluffed his wings to keep the water off and keep him warm and dry. And just as he did, he saw 3 of the most beautiful birds he had ever seen in his life. They were large and white, black beaks, black eyes, long, long, graceful necks. Something inside of him stirred. He felt as if he recognized something inside of those birds, the way that they looked. Oh, but they were too beautiful for him to even get close to. But still, something in his heart soared when he saw those beautiful birds swim away from him. Well, the weather began to change. It had been summer, and now it became fall. And the leaves on all of the trees took off their green dresses and shirts and put on brightly colored ones as if they were going to a party. And now they waved in the breeze wearing their red and orange and yellow shirts and dresses. It was as if they were playing the maracas, one last party before they fell to the ground. And then winter came. And it became very cold, so cold that little Duckling had to swim faster and faster to prevent the ice from closing in around him. But one night it became so cold the ice formed a block around his feet, and there he was, trapped inside the ice. There was a man walking by the next morning. He saw the plight of the duckling. He took off his wooden shoe and cracked the ice. And then he picked the duckling up and put him under his arm so he would warm up. And he took him home. Now, he lived in a very busy house, 7 children, and a very large wife. They were always yelling and shouting and running about, and his wife was always busy taking care of the children in the house and making things run exactly right. When they brought the ugly little duckling in, the children thought it was a game. They thought it was a toy, and so they began running after him, clapping their hands and scampering and squealing with delight and yelping for joy. Well, the ugly duckling, he was frightened. He thought they were going to treat him like all of the animals in the barnyard had treated him. And so he scurried about trying to get underneath things. He was so frightened. Well, by then, the very large mother and wife began to clap her hands. Well, this frightened the ugly duckling, and he flew up into the air as quickly as he could and as well as he could. And then he knocked over the butter churn, and he knocked over the eggs, and he got into the flour bin, and everyone was yelling, and it was mayhem and chaos, and he was frightened, and the children were screaming with delight. They thought it was a great game. Shoo, shoo, said the mother, and she opened up the window, and wasn't the ugly duckling so happy he could get out of that house? And he dropped into the deep, cold snow outside of their home. I won't tell you all of the hardships that the ugly duckling endured that winter. He was very cold and very hungry, and so lonely. Where in the world can a little duck go now that I have no family? Where in the world can this little duck go? Nobody wants me. And he stayed there on the water by himself all winter. It was a very harsh and cold winter. This is something remarkable about the duckling. Life had treated him so hard and had been quite cruel to him, but his heart had never turned bitter. He found all around him so much beauty. He could see the joy in the natural world. And even though life was hard for him, as he walked around, he thought, isn't the world a beautiful place? The winds of spring began to blow, and the trees leafed out. And now the turtles, which had fallen down into the mud at the bottom of the ponds, began to come up and lay eggs, and the fish once again swam. The bears that had been asleep awaked. Now they were looking for food, and with them were their cubs. The squirrels that had amnesia were looking for all of the nuts that they had buried, but they couldn't find them, so they went looking for more nuts. And the trees put on their green shirts and dresses once again. There was a vanilla scent to the air. The worms began making pilgrimages through the forest. The bunny rabbits came up and began looking for mates so they could make more bunny rabbits. The dragonflies flew and the birds were out. And all those birds that had flown away for the winter, the cardinals and the wild geese and the ducks and the robins, came back and chirped, hello. The ugly little duckling had grown, and yet he didn't know it. He swam around by himself, and that's when he saw the white birds with their long necks, their black beaks, and their black eyes. There was a group of them, and they were swimming towards him. Oh, they're so beautiful, even more beautiful than I remember. But I am so ugly. I don't want them to see me. But the birds did something unusual. They swam over to the ugly duckling and said to one another, oh, look, a swan, a beautiful swan, a boy. Oh, perhaps one of us will marry him. The ugly duckling looked down at his reflection, and he saw that he wasn't an ugly duckling anymore. Now, he had a long, white, graceful neck and a black beak and dark, large, black eyes. His wings were powerful and big. He had grown. He was a swan. You know, another bird might have had a bitter heart and might have blamed and been angry with some of the other creatures for the way they had treated him until he came into his own true nature. But the ugly duckling who turned into a swan, he had a beautiful heart, as if all the hardships had opened his heart so it was 3 or 4 times larger than it ever had been. And he thought, I'm so grateful for all of the hard things that have ever happened to me. For now, in my moment of happiness, I can feel all the joy and love the swans are giving me. Where in the world can a little duck go when he has no family? Now I'm a swan, and I can go, for my family loves me. And the ugly duckling, who had turned into a swan, swam away with his new family and felt all the love and joy they had to give him, that the world contained, until the end of his days. Thank you.
So I want to introduce our next storyteller, Angela Lloyd. And I met Angela so many years ago. And she's been a friend. And she's a really unique and wonderful storyteller. She actually is a storyteller in residence for a Quaker school and tells stories to the children in all grades throughout the year. She's done some really beautiful work and comes from a family where her mother was a songwriter and a musician, as Angela is too, a kind of natural and great musician. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing the story of the red shoes and how it's been shaped for all of us. So, Angela, thank you so much for being here with us.
Good morning. There was once a young girl who lived with her mother. The people in town said she was very pretty. But they always noticed she went barefoot in the summer. And in the winter, she wore thick wooden clogs that rubbed her instep, made it red. A shoemaker's wife, after her husband passed away, found some red fabric, and as best she could, and with good heart, sewed a pair of soft shoes for this young girl. And when they were complete, she did see they were clumsy, the shoemaker's wife, but she took them to the girl. And as it happened, the young girl's mother had died. She gave them to the young girl, and the young girl, not having anything else to wear, slipped on those soft red shoes. And she walked behind her mother's coffin. You gotta walk that lonesome valley. You gotta walk it by yourself. Ain't no one here gonna walk it for you. You gotta walk it for yourself. My mother walked it by herself. She had to walk that lonely valley on her own. As the young girl walked with a few others behind, an old lady drew up in a carriage, and she saw the girl, and she saw her ragged clothing, and she went to the minister, and after the graveyard service asked the minister if she could take that young girl, that she would raise her, bring her up, give her a good home. When the young girl was asked to climb in the carriage with the old lady, she thought to herself, perhaps it was because the old woman had noticed her shoes. When they got back to the old woman's house, the old lady took those shoes and she said, "You can't wear red shoes to a funeral service." And she threw them in the stove to burn. The young girl lived there with the old lady, and she was kind. She taught her how to read and sew, And as Karen grew, it came time for her confirmation in the church. She was 12. And that meant that she would have a new dress and new shoes. And so they went into town and they bought a white dress, as was customary. And then they went to a shoemaker's shop. Now, several days earlier, the queen had ridden through their village, and she was accompanied by the princess, her daughter. And they went to the castle in that place. And all the villagers went to see them. And the young girl, she noticed that the princess was placed on a box in the window so you could see her whole body. And our heroine noticed the princess's shoes. They were red. And when the young girl saw those, she just thought to herself, there was nothing more beautiful than those shoes. So when they went to the shoemaker's shop to buy new shoes for her confirmation, she saw red patent leather shoes on the wall. There were glass cases of all kinds of shoes. But there between two pairs of boots was a pair of red patent leather shoes. And when the young girl asked to try them on, the shoemaker, having measured her feet, he gladly took them down and he fit them on. And he said, you know, these were sewn for a count's daughter and they didn't fit very well, but they fit you beautifully. Well, the old lady could not see very well, and she did not know the shoes were red, but she did notice their shine. She said, they shine. They must be patent leather. The young girl said, yes. And so they took them home, and on her confirmation, our heroine dressed in her white dress, and she slipped on her brand new shoes. And when she entered for the blessing by the minister, she was walking alone. And as she walked down the aisle, she noticed the paintings and the gravestones carved with ministers and their wives' faces all around. And they looked as though they were looking only at her shoes. When she reached the altar and knelt down for the blessing of the bishop's hand on her head, she did not feel the hand on his head. She only could think of her shoes. When he lifted the goblet to her mouth, she didn't taste the wine. She only could think of her shoes. By the afternoon, all the people who had attended the service told the old lady that the shoes were red, and she was very angry when they got home. She took them off, and she told her to put them away, put them high in a closet, and from now on she was to wear black shoes to church. So, still, our heroine would go to the closet and open the door and look. And the next Sunday when they went to church, she looked at the black shoes. She looked at the red shoes, and she slipped them on. Now it was a beautiful day, bright and clear, and they decided they would walk and not take the carriage. And so by the time they arrived at the church, the old lady's shoes were dusty. And standing outside by the front door was an invalid soldier. You could see his tattered uniform, and he was leaning on a crutch. And he had a beard, and it was red. It was long. And as the old woman walked up close to the steps, the invalid soldier stepped down, and he took out an old handkerchief, and he offered to dust the woman's shoes. He knelt down, and she put a foot forward, and our heroine, she put her foot forward. And he looked up at her, and he looked down, and he said, Such pretty little dancing shoes. And then she felt him lift her foot and felt him tap the bottom of the sole of her shoe. He said, may they fit tightly for the dance. They went into the service. And again, our heroine was hard not to think of anything else. And she was again so aware of the painted faces on the walls and the carved faces and their portraits. It just looked as though all they were looking at were her feet, were her shoes. When they came out of the service, the old lady started to climb. She started to climb into a carriage. Her driver had brought it to the church. When the invalid soldier approached the carriage, and just as our heroine stepped up in, he again tapped the bottom of her foot with his crutch. And he said, may you dance all your life, such pretty little dancing shoes. And just by instinct, she stepped back down out of the carriage and she did a little dancing step. But then the next thing, when she wanted to get back in the carriage, her feet wouldn't go. They started dancing, and she found herself dancing in the courtyard of the church and then dancing round the corner. And the coachman dropped his reins and he chased after her and he picked her up. But her feet would not stop moving. And he carried her back to the carriage, and clumsily he put her inside the carriage. And with the coachman and the old lady helping, they were both able to take those shoes off her feet. The old woman was kicked, but the shoes finally were off, and they made their way home. Some time passed, and doctors came to see the old woman, and they said to the young girl, she is dying, and you are the only one here to take care of her. So please stay close. And they left, and she was getting some hot tea for the old woman when she remembered there was a ball in town that night. And she gave the tea, and the woman took a sip and closed her eyes, and then she just thought to herself, well, she's going to die anyway. And she went to her closet and put on the red shoes and went to the ball. And there, every time she tried to dance to the left, her feet and shoes went to the right. Every time she tried to dance down the hall with her partner, she was turned around by her feet and shoes and danced right out the door, down the stairs and down the street and into the dark forest. She could not stop. Her feet would not stop. And as she made her way into the forest, she thought she saw the moon. But it wasn't the moon. It was a face. And in the clearing, in the trees, she came upon the invalid soldier. He was there with this grin on his face, and he said, may those shoes stick tightly to your feet and dance, dance, dance away. She was horrified. There was nothing she could do. She only could go where her feet took her, and they took her to the churchyard. But the dead, they weren't going to rise and dance with her. They have better things to do. That's what Hans Christian Andersen wrote in the story. They have better things to do. She danced up to the churchyard door before she noticed it was open. And there, standing in the doorway, was an angel. He was magnificent, tall, and white flowing gossamer robes, but his face was very stern. And as she danced up the stairs, he pulled his golden sword and held it across his body. And he said, "You may not enter. You must dance. You will dance until you are skeleton, till your skin is yellow, till you are bones. You will dance, dance, dance." She turned away, and in her tears followed her feet. And she traveled over hills and meadows, and in the night and in the day, and for weeks. And finally, she came to a minister's house, and she asked, please, if they would let her stay there. And the minister's wife took pity on her. She said, "I just need a place to rest and a roof over my head, some food." And they welcomed her, and she helped take care of their young children, and they loved her. They played with the young girl. But anytime those children would talk about growing up and being a princess and living in a fine castle, they always noticed she would look down, she would shake her head. She was repentant. She went to sleep every night praying to God to forgive her. And after a week, she went to the church. She went back to her church. But as she entered, she saw, "I have to say something to you." One day in those travels of the days, she came to a cottage, and she knew it well. It was the executioner's cottage. She tapped on the window, and the executioner, the one the village calls on when there's an evil person who needs their head cut off, he came to the door. She said, please, I need your help." He said, I am the one who cuts off people's heads. My axe is vibrating as I talk to you." She said, no, don't cut off my head. I need my head so I can repent. Cut off my feet. He said, "Cut off your feet?" She said, "My shoes. Take off my shoes." And with his axe, he cut the shoes off her feet. And she left in the forest, and she could see the shoes ahead of her. So that day, weeks later, when she went to the church, and as she approached, she could see the shoes dancing up ahead of her. And she was horrified. And she turned and ran back to the house, and again spent her days in prayer and asking for forgiveness. And a week later, again, she tried to go back to the church, and again the shoes were dancing in front of her. Finally, after some time passed, one day the minister and his wife, they said, "We're going to church. Won't you come with us?" And she looked at them, and she looked at her clothes, and she just shook her head. And they left. And she went into her tiny room. It just had room for a bed and a chair. And she sat down, and she said, "Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy." And suddenly she felt a breeze. And there, standing in her room, was the angel, the same one who had barred her entrance to the church parsonage. And he stood and he touched with his sword the ceiling of her room, and it rose up. And there in the ceiling where he touched it, it opened, and a star shone down. And she was sitting, and she heard the sound of the people singing at the church, heard it coming in the window. "Glory, glory, 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 hallelujah. I am gonna lay my burdens down. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Gonna lay my burdens down. Burden down. The next thing she knew, she was sitting in the church with the people she knew around her. And a woman turned and looked at her and said, I'm so glad you came. I'm so glad you came. At that place, in that moment, her heart got so full, it broke. And she settled back in her chair, and light filled the room. And light filled the room. A la puerta del cielo, at the door of heaven, they're selling shoes for angels who go barefoot. A la puerta del cielo venden zapatos para los angelitos que andan descalzos. Duérmete, niño, duérmete, niño, duérmete, niño, arru, arru. I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. When I get to heaven, gonna put on my shoes, gonna walk all over heaven. Hans Christian Andersen ends the story that when she was in heaven, nobody asked her about those red shoes.